She's an outgoing teen who started keeping secrets.
I did not approve of her dating him, and she was too young to date in the first place.
Then, one day, without warning, she's gone.
She loved her whole family. She wouldn't just leave us and not say nothing.
A puzzling phone call out of the blue stuns her mother.
It was like, it's me, Mom. I'm okay, don't worry.
Was it so quick because she was being told to get off the phone? Did somebody have her?
Investigators recognize a pattern with chilling ramifications.
We have 3 young girls missing, and we're not getting an answer to where they are or what happened to them.
Until a shocking discovery in a Cleveland home makes international headlines.
At that moment, I thought, maybe it's Ashley.
Old Ashley Summers and her mother Jennifer are home together, sharing a guilty pleasure.
Scary movies, always scary movies at nighttime, me and her. I was more scared than her, of course. I always cover my eyes when, you hear the music. I would tell her to tell me when it was over.
Ashley and her mother have always been extremely close.
Like sisters, best friends, we were everywhere together.
Every summer, when Jennifer can get time off work, she and Ashley join the rest of their extended family on trips to nearby amusement parks. Unlike her mother, Ashley can never get enough of the roller coasters.
She was always doing something silly, and she would bring a smile to anybody's face.
As her mother's firstborn, Ashley grew up surrounded by a very large web of extended family, including numerous cousins, more than 10 aunts and uncles, grandaunts and granduncles, plus her grandparents.
Everybody loved Ashley. She was the first baby.
Because Ashley's biological father was never part of her life, her mother's family stepped in to fill the void.
Our family was her life, her aunts were her best friends, like sisters. She had lots of love, lots of support.
I used to babysit her a lot while my sister went to work.
They used to, play house, play school together. Debbie was 10, 11 years old when Ashley was born, so they used to play shopping, with their cash register.
When Ashley got older, her role as firstborn began to evolve. She would eventually be joined by 5 younger half-siblings.
She's affectionate, and she would help take care of the younger children as her mother had more children.
When her mom was at work, she would take care of the younger ones and help out. And she was great. She's awesome with kids.
She would push them down the street in a stroller and go to the park with them. She enjoyed them. They all had fun.
But as Ashley closes in on her 14th birthday, her family notices changes in her.
That's why she was always wanting to be gone, do stuff with her friends.
In addition, according to family members, Ashley's relationship with her mother's long-term boyfriend, who has helped to raise her, has become tense.
Like, you're not my dad, stuff like that. She had a little attitude to her.
Yet the biggest shift in Ashley was still to come.
She didn't like boys at all. Now she started liking boys and becoming a young lady.
The almost 14-year-old gets a serious boyfriend, 16-year-old Jean Gill, who lives nearby. Jean says they had met in the neighborhood that spring. When Ashley tries to keep this brand new relationship a secret from her mom, it backfires.
The kids told me, my kids told me, because I was at work when he'd come over. I wasn't very happy because I did not approve of her dating him. And she was too young to date in the first place, I felt. So I told her she couldn't see him.
According to her mother, this disapproval only seems to intensify Ashley's feelings for Jean.
I know she loved him.
Soon, Jennifer says, this disagreement between them takes an unexpected turn.
She took money out of my drawer, like my paycheck, I think she took money here and there. I never said nothing, but this time it was like all the money I had in my drawer.
Then, the young teen comes home with a tattoo of her boyfriend Gene's name on her arm, and her mother realizes where at least some of the money went.
She didn't ask her mom to get the tattoo, nothing. She just went and did it on her own.
I was so mad she came home with a tattoo, so mad.
Unsure how to reason with Ashley without heightening the tension over Gene, Jennifer asks her own mother, who lives about 4 miles away across town, for some help. The two decide it would be best if Ashley went and stayed with her grandmother for a while.
It was the summertime, so she would stay over there. I just thought she would just, not be bad for my mom, because it's her grandma, and can't be bad for grandma. Gotta listen to grandma.
And there's another motive behind Jennifer's decision.
It would be to keep her away from Gene. I thought that she was too far away from him, so she wasn't seeing him no more.
Living under her grandmother's roof seems to help. Since school is out for the summer, Ashley also takes the opportunity to hang out with some other relatives with whom she's close. By mid-June, she is spending most of her time at the home of her granduncle, Kevin.
That's where she'd have the most fun at, She'd get bored at my mom's house because my mom worked, there'd be no one there, so. Kevin's house, cousins would always be over there, so that's why she would be there more.
She'd go over there and stay. All the kids love Kevin.
It's better. Kevin always spoiled her to death, so whatever she wanted, he'd do it.
Jennifer says that even though Ashley moves around from one relative's house to the next, she touches base with her regularly.
I'd call and check on her daily, every other day. Depend if I worked that day.
The week after her 14th birthday, Ashley also goes to see one of her 2 aunts, Deborah Summers, who just moved into a new apartment in the suburbs of Cleveland.
It's about time I moved in there when she came over.
While at her apartment, Ashley surprises her aunt with a request.
She wanted to come live with me. We were watching movies and stuff. She was talking about it, and I said, yeah, you can come move in. Just let me know. Bring your stuff over.
But despite their mutual agreement, Ashley never follows up on this offer. 2 weeks later, on a warm 4th of July afternoon, some of Ashley's family gathers for a celebration at her granduncle Keith's house.
The event was my birthday, July 4th. And we have a party every year on my birthday.
There was always a lot of family friends, and a lot of the kids.
Ashley shows up for the party too.
Always give you a hug, and she always says she loves you.
And she's just by herself and looked a little down in the dumps.
Ashley is there without her mother or half-siblings. According to her hosts, that day she appears to have walked to their house from her granduncle Kevin's home, almost 2 miles away.
I says, honey, it's hot. Do you want to get in the pool? Okay. And I gave her a t-shirt to wear.
Ashley soon starts having fun with her younger cousins, and her mood appears to brighten.
Happy, playing, laughing, even dancing with the rest of the kids. They had a great time.
I would say she was there maybe 3 or 4 hours.
She ate and everything, got dried and dressed.
And she came out and gave me a hug, said, I love you, I'm gonna go to Chris's house.
Christina Summers, Ashley's other aunt, lives just blocks away, at most a 10-minute walk. It's approximately 6 p.m. the evening of July 4th, a moment that will be replayed over and over in the minds of Ashley's loved ones in the years to come.
She said her goodbyes to everybody, and she turned the corner, and I'd never seen her since.
On the evening of July 4th, 2007, 14-year-old Ashley Summers left a family party saying she was on her way to her Aunt Christina's. But she never arrives. Her mother assumes that Ashley is staying with either her grandmother or her granduncle Kevin, who'd let Ashley stay with him for the past 3 weeks.
Ashley had been known to spend the night at family members' homes, not come home for a couple of days, and her mother was always okay with that because she just knew that she was at somebody's house.
But after 2 days pass, without her mother Jennifer hearing from Ashley, something doesn't feel right. So she calls Kevin's house to check on her daughter. And what he tells her is concerning.
He said she hadn't been over there in 2 days. He said, I don't know, I thought she went to your mom's house or my sister's. I'm like, that's weird because she's usually at Kevin's house the most.
According to Kevin, the last time he saw Ashley was the morning before she left for his brother's 4th of July pool party. And the two of them had gotten into an argument. Kevin says Ashley was engaged in some family gossip on her phone. He disapproved and told Ashley to stop it.
My family, we're so close that, of course, we argue a lot.
When Ashley ignored his demand, Kevin says he got angry with her.
He just grabbed the phone from her and broke it.
As a result, Ashley's mother no longer has any way of reaching her daughter, nor can Ashley easily call her.
I called around to everyone doing a circle of phone calls to find out where she was, but no one's seen her.
Ashley's mother realizes it's been days since anyone in her tight-knit family has laid eyes on her 14-year-old. Ashley has fallen through their family safety net.
Horrible. So we're all like, where is she? Like, crying, like, thinking the worst.
In that area, there's a lot of prostitution, there's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of gang activity. I mean, the average age for girls that are trafficked are 14 to 17 years old.
I don't know what to do at this point. I don't know what to do. So I went to the police station and filed her missing person report.
Because of Ashley's recent battle of wills with her mother, the Cleveland Police Department thinks Ashley is a truant.
The rebellious behaviors, the spending the night at family members' homes without anybody really knowing where she was. I think at first it was kind of treated as a runaway, that she'll be back. You know, it'll be a few days, but Ashley will be back. She's done this before.
I was like, she wouldn't run away. Like, I was trying to explain that she wouldn't run away.
It's not like her to do that. Like, she loved her whole family. She wouldn't just leave us and not say nothing.
The 14-year-old has always been a heavy social media user who logs in to stay in touch with friends and family, including her boyfriend, Gene Gill.
On it all day long. That's why she'd come to my house to use me for my computer. As soon as she walked in the door, she'd sit down and play the computer.
Now, Ashley has uncharacteristically vanished from her social media account.
Her last seen login was July 4th.
I would think a 14-year-old would have that overwhelming desire to have to get on that MySpace.
I actually went on MySpace to find, I looked at every comment on her thing, like to see if I can get a hold of anybody that knows anything.
As far as her family can tell, Ashley hasn't reached out to a single friend or relative since then. Not even her boyfriend, Gene Gill. That summer, Gene says he and Ashley had spent almost every day together, despite her mother's attempts to keep them apart. But right before the July 4th holiday, he says he went out of town for a family reunion and was away when Ashley went missing. Ashley's worried loved ones get together to organize searches.
As soon as she was gone 24 hours, the whole family came over. We were looking around our neighborhood, around where her aunt lives. We were on foot, we were riding bikes, we were in cars.
We all go as a team. We go out there and we look. Put pictures on everybody's cars and mailboxes.
Almost immediately, the flyers yield leads on possible sightings of Ashley. at a number of locations across the neighborhood.
People were seeing her, then I'm like, why is she just wandering around? Why isn't she coming home or contacting us?
My first thought was she took off with her boyfriend because her mom didn't approve of it.
No one in the family confronts her boyfriend Gene directly. Instead, they post some of Ashley's missing flyers near Gene's home.
When I was putting them up, I'm like, Ashley's gonna see this and come home because she's gonna know I'm worried, or she's gonna be like, oh, I better go home or I'm gonna be in trouble.
Something curious then happens.
The next day, they were all gone. So someone went behind me and took them all down. I thought maybe Ashley and Gene were doing it.
The Cleveland Police Department reaches out to Gene, who's only 16 at the time. Details of what he told them have still not been revealed by law enforcement to this day.
He was interviewed more than once, so that's obviously something that didn't result in any kind of charges or any kind of answers.
Ashley's best friend says when she questioned Gene about Ashley's disappearance, he always responded that he didn't know what happened to her. It's the same response Ashley's aunt says he gave her.
I even messaged Gene a few times on Facebook as well. I don't know nothing. That's all we hear. I don't know nothing.
According to Gene, the last time he saw Ashley was a few days before the 4th of July, when he and his father dropped her off at Kevin's house. His last memory of her was watching Ashley walk inside. As weeks tick by, Ashley's mom becomes desperate to find her oldest child, so she decides to follow Gene.
I would just drive around till I seen him. Some days I would see him, some days I wouldn't.
One night, she observes something she considers very strange.
I seen him going to an abandoned house, so I called the police and had them check it out to see if Ashley might have been in there, if she was hiding.
Ashley is not in the house. Despite her suspicions about Gene's involvement, Jennifer says she never confronts him face to face. 4 weeks pass with no solid leads. Then, one afternoon, while Ashley's mother Jennifer is at work, her phone rings. The call is from a blocked number.
I got a private phone call. I just happened to be outside on my break. And I answered it, and it was like, it's me, Mom. I'm okay, don't worry. My heart dropped. I couldn't say nothing because it was so fast. You're like, Ashley, but she'd already hung up. I called everyone, my whole family. I was like, I think Ashley just called me, Ashley just called me. And then as I'm doing, I'm like, then I started thinking, was that really her? Was that really her? Because why would she do that and not talk,
If it was Ashley, then was it so quick because she was being told to get off the phone? Did somebody have her?
By November 2007, 4 months have passed since 14-year-old Ashley Summers mysteriously vanished in Cleveland.
We just spent a lot of time driving around looking for her and putting posters out and nothing. No one's seen her, nothing. It was like she just went somewhere and never was seen again.
Knowing Ashley had been head over heels in love with her boyfriend Gene Gill when she went missing, Ashley's mother says she can't believe her daughter would go anywhere without him. But according to Gene, that's exactly what happened. He says Ashley abruptly stopped communicating with him by phone and MySpace at the same time he was out of town with his family. Perhaps because her uncle had broken her cell phone. But Gene says when Ashley failed to reach out to him again in any way, he knew something was very wrong. The mystery deepens even further the night of November 17th. Ashley's grandfather and her step-grandmother, Linda Summers, are driving through the near west side of Cleveland when they spot someone who looks very familiar.
Loring Avenue is 25 miles an hour, so you're not like speeding down the road. There was this girl walking down the sidewalk towards us.
According to Linda, the girl is Ashley's size, about 5'5" and 130 pounds. But what really draws her attention is her face. She's a dead ringer for Ashley. But her hair is different.
We had received tips that her hair may have been cut short and dyed blonde.
If those tips are true, a young woman matching that description is staring into their car.
We had a silver Grand Marquis, so it's not your common, just everyday car that you see driving down the road.
Her grandparents wonder if this is Ashley, and if she recognizes them.
By the time we turned around and got back, she had disappeared down a side street next to a gas station.
The young woman is gone.
Was it really her? Like, I don't know. I was sad that she was hiding from us, you know, like, I didn't understand why she would hide from us, why she was avoiding everyone.
6 months pass. By May of 2008, it's been almost a year since Ashley went missing, and her family is desperate for answers. Her disappearance finally comes to the attention of the FBI.
The FBI Cleveland Division was alerted from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children about Ashley Summers missing from our area.
The FBI sees Ashley's case in a disturbing new light. There have been other teenage girls, besides Ashley, who have disappeared from Cleveland.
At the time, we had 2 other young girls that had been missing for a few years.
I knew about the other woman. I didn't know that they could have, you know, I didn't think they were going to be related or anything like that.
We had Amanda Berry missing since April of 2003, and then we had Gina DeJesus missing from April 2004. So here we are in 2007, and Ashley goes missing.
Maybe Ashley never ran away at all, and a serial kidnapper is preying on young women in their neighborhood.
What are we dealing with in this area when we have 3 young girls missing and we're not getting an answer to where they are or what happened to them?
The similarities between Ashley and the other 2 missing girls are striking. They all have close ties to their families. At different times, they all attended the same school. Most important, they all disappeared from the same general area on the west side of Cleveland.
We began looking at them individually and as possibly being linked. Anytime there was a lead on Ashley, we asked about Gina and Amanda. Anytime there was a lead on Amanda, we asked about Gina and Ashley.
I was kind of happy that someone was going to be looking for her, but then I got more worried of what they were going to find, you know.
Maybe she did leave on her own. Maybe she did initially run away, but because she's 14 years old at the time, what does she do? She has no money. You know, she has no food. She only has the clothes that she took with her. She's susceptible to, you know, the predators that are out there.
The FBI begins at square one with Ashley's case, in the hope of generating new leads.
Ashley had a lot of friends that she went places with. She seemed to be a free spirit in that she kind of was at that age where she wanted to do what she wanted to do, and no one was going to stop her.
In-depth interviews are conducted with those who were close to Ashley.
When a child goes missing, the first thing we look at are family and friends and acquaintances.
Everyone in my family, everyone that she knew, and just people from the neighborhood that could have seen her.
In particular, Ashley's older male relatives and her boyfriend Gene are closely questioned.
They had a few of us given polygraphs. They're going to take polygraph tests.
The FBI will not discuss any of the results.
That's something that obviously I can't talk about in specifics, but it is part of a normal investigation.
FBI agents also scour the city of Cleveland, particularly the area where the 3 girls were last seen.
We went door to door, asking questions and walking through people's houses, you know, people giving us permission to just walk through and look in their properties. We canvassed that whole area for sex offenders, for people with any kind of criminal history.
Yet neither the interviews nor the searches yield information leading to Ashley or the two other missing young women. The phone call Ashley's mother received from someone she thought was her daughter is also scrutinized by the FBI. Trying to trace the call, they pull phone records and ask Ashley's mother to pinpoint when it happened.
I got the telephone number list from my phone, but at that point, I've been so long, I couldn't remember what day it was, so it was kind of hard to narrow down.
We just don't know if that was her or not, but it gives you hope that maybe it was.
Ashley's mother is still haunted by the memory of her last moment with her daughter, about a week before she went missing.
Last time I seen her would have been my sister Christina's house. I'm like, I wish I would have known if I hugged her or...
Almost 5 years pass. Then, in the spring of 2013, there's a stunning turn of events in the FBI's investigation to find the 3 girls who disappeared from Cleveland, including Ashley.
What has happened in Cleveland over the last day and a half is so plainly amazing, we almost do not have words for it on TV.
May 6th, 2013. A next-door neighbor notices something odd at 2207 Seymour Avenue.
I hear this girl screaming, and she going nuts. So I come outside, and I know there's nobody that's supposed to be screaming next door to my house because there's no girl that lives in that house. So that's a dead giveaway to something wrong. She said, my name is Amanda Berry. Please get me out this house.
Please, help me, I'm Amanda Berry.
You need police, fire, or ambulance?
I'm the police.
Okay, and what's going on there?
I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here, I'm free now.
More remarkable, Berry tells police there are 2 other women still trapped inside the house. One is Gina DeJesus, who's been missing for 9 years.
Gina and Amanda have been found. They're alive. And chills went through my body because nobody had to say their last name. Everybody knew who Gina and Amanda was. There's a third person, and we didn't know who that third person was.
Inside 2207 Seymour, the young women have been living in a hellish nightmare of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse at the hands of 52-year-old Ariel Castro. The former school bus driver is quickly taken into police custody.
Once we heard that there was 3 women missing for 10 years found in Ariel Castro's home, that gave us hope. I called Jennifer. I told Jennifer, hey, 3 teenagers were found in a house. I don't know all their names.
Ashley's mother, Jennifer, is astonished by the unfolding story.
I was actually watching the news and I was like, oh my goodness. These girls have been found, and then the third one, I thought at that moment was Ashley. So I didn't know what to do. I'm like, should I go to the hospital? Should I do this? We're getting ready for them to call me and be like, we found Ashley.
May 2013. Following one of the most shocking headlines in Cleveland history, the Summers family prays that the 3rd girl rescued from Ariel Castro's house is their beloved Ashley. Hours after Amanda Berry's miraculous escape, authorities announce the identity of his 3rd victim.
The captivity and the kidnapping of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight.
There was a girl, Michelle Knight, that the FBI didn't know about. She was an adult when she went missing, and I don't believe a missing persons report had really actually ever been filled out for her.
Michelle had been kidnapped by Castro in August 2002, before Amanda and Gina. She'd been held captive, the longest of all three women, almost 11 years.
I can only imagine what Ashley's mom was going through for that split second of thinking that third person was Ashley, and then to find out that it wasn't.
I got a new sense of hope out of it all, though, because, it's a great thing that, them three ladies were found. I'm just waiting for my turn now.
Although Ashley was not found in Castro's home, the FBI and Cleveland police investigate whether he might have somehow been involved in her disappearance.
They found those girls over in Seymour, and the last time Ashley was seen was at our place on Woodbridge, between 41st and 44th. And it's not very far from that area.
In fact, Castro's home was only 1.5 miles away from Keith's 4th of July pool party.
Castro was asked about Ashley. There was nothing that indicated Ashley was there. There was nothing indicating that Castro had any interactions with Ashley. Amanda, Gina, and Michelle never knew of another female being held captive or being brought to the house besides them.
Even though the FBI finds no connection to Ashley's case, unconfirmed stories still make their way back to Ashley's family.
There was a rumor that in the basement of Castro's house, it had R.I.P. Ashley.
Somebody came in and said, somebody found Ashley's initials in somebody's basement and they said she's dead. And my sister just fell right to her knees and we all started crying. It was horrible.
That was just people in the neighborhood making up things. Obviously, our evidence response team processed that scene, processed every little centimeter of that house, and there was nothing like that.
In July of 2013, Ariel Castro pleads guilty to 937 criminal charges, including multiple counts of kidnapping and rape, and 2 counts of aggravated murder, for violently terminating the pregnancies of Michelle Knight while holding her captive. Castro's sentenced to life in prison, plus 1,000 years. In September, while awaiting his reassignment to prison, Castro hangs himself. He'd been in custody less than 4 months. According to investigators, lessons learned from the joyful return of Amanda, Gina, and Michelle changed some assumptions about Ashley's case. Amanda and Gina knew the daughters of Ariel Castro, which was why they were willing to get in his vehicle.
It just makes you think all that stranger danger is a good warning, but there needs to be an additional warning in there too, because a lot of those predators you possibly may know. So we may be looking for Ashley, who willingly went with someone.
In the summer of 2012, a year before the 3 young women were discovered, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had released an age-progressed image of Ashley, created by forensic artists. The image approximates what Ashley might look like as the 18-year-old she now would be.
We don't have anything that indicates that she's not out there. So we take every opportunity that we can to get her name and picture out anywhere we can.
Ashley's mother, Jennifer, had high hopes for her daughter's 18th birthday.
I thought her 18th birthday, she's gonna come home. She's an adult now.
She missed so much. She missed all of high school. Didn't get to graduate even.
But the big day comes and goes with no word from Ashley. It's not until January 2015, 7.5 years after she disappeared, that there's finally another glimmer of hope in Ashley's case.
I reached out to Linda, and I said, Linda, I think you really need to look into this. This girl looks just like Ashley.
City Councilman Angel Arroyo was alerted to this image on Rhode Island's Most Wanted website.
I immediately thought it was Ashley. Yeah, and it looked just like her.
Linda sent me the link, and a couple other people actually sent me the same link.
It was absolutely amazing. And I think when we all saw it, it was like, holy cow, is this her?
In January 2015, 7.5 long years after 14-year-old Ashley Summers disappeared in Cleveland, the FBI finally has a strong lead in her case, thanks to this picture.
It was a great face shot of a young lady looking straight into the ATM camera from her car and a young man with her. It was a striking resemblance to Ashley.
Could the photo be proof that Ashley, who would now be 21, is alive and well?
Things had gone cold, and at that point, it gave us like a renewed sense of hope.
Rhode Island police suspect the camera had captured the young woman attempting to commit identity theft.
They didn't know who this young lady was, and they were asking the public for assistance.
The FBI begins a far-reaching media push to try to locate the woman in the Rhode Island ATM photo, wherever she may be.
We put her up on the billboards, up and down the East Coast. Media outlets all over the country started picking up on this. Is this Ashley Summers?
As a result, Ashley's case gets more exposure than ever before. In March of 2015, the Dr. Phil Show asks facial recognition experts to weigh in.
We can list some of the similarities that you pointed to: the heart-shaped face, forehead, eye width, corner-to-corner expression.
There's like an 80% facial recognition between this girl in the picture and Ashley. They thought it 80% looked like Ashley.
At the same time, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children releases a video aimed at alerting tattoo artists to Ashley's case. No longer a child, she may have decided to change the Jean tattoo on her right arm.
She had that tattoo of her boyfriend's name on her arm with a heart. You know, does she still have that? Did she get it changed to something else? That's very distinctive.
By now, the namesake in Ashley's tattoo, Jean Gill, has been in and out of jail and prison for a number of offenses, including robbery and drug possession, beginning 14 months after Ashley vanished. According to Jean, Ashley's disappearance and the subsequent investigation triggered emotional difficulties for him. To this day, Jean maintains he has no idea why Ashley went missing or what happened to her. In July 2015, thanks to their nationwide campaign, the FBI finally learns the identity of the woman captured in the ATM photo.
She was identified, and unfortunately, it wasn't Ashley.
It was upsetting. We were really hoping that that would be like the break, that we would be able to find her that way.
The media campaign around the ATM photo elicits a response from the family of the woman in the picture.
Her parents actually called, her parents and an attorney. She was known to engage in criminal behavior. She had done things before. They weren't in immediate contact with her, but they immediately recognized her.
It's yet another dead end for Ashley's family. Although some of them confess that deep down, they were never completely convinced of the resemblance.
I'd like to think if I seen a picture of her, I'd know instantly, and I didn't feel that way when I seen this picture. I think she looked a lot older.
2 years later, in July 2017, Ashley's family marks a painful anniversary. Their 10th year without the fun-loving girl who owned their hearts.
I never thought that day, you know, that would lead to this day, you know, just know nothing from her still.
the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children releases yet another age-progressed image of Ashley. She would now be 24. It helps keep hope alive that someone, somewhere could recognize her, and she might be returned to her family, much like Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight.
10 years later, she could be anywhere, and that's what we try to hold on to. Amanda and Gina survived that and are now leading great lives.
We're all here for her no matter what. Don't be scared. There's a family that loves you.
It's a feeling shared by Ashley's little sister, Vicki Summers.
I'm Victoria Summers, and I'm making this video for my older sister Ashley, who is a missing child and has been gone since July 7th, 2007.
When they were young, Vicki shared a bedroom with Ashley.
Ottawa is the kind of city that can make a terrible secret look ordinary. It has quiet residential streets lined with modest houses, small backyards hidden behind fences, apartment buildings where neighbors pass one another in hallways without knowing each other's names, parks where children play during the day, and empty paths disappear beneath the trees after dark. From a distance, nothing seems unusual. That is what makes certain crimes so difficult to see. They do not always begin with a scream. Sometimes they begin with an argument behind a closed door. Sometimes they begin with a woman who simply stops answering the telephone. Sometimes they begin with a man moving into an apartment that does not belong to him. While the world around him accepts the explanation, he is carefully prepared. And sometimes, the truth does not emerge for years. In Ottawa, one man managed to live with a secret for nearly 2 decades. His name was Camille Cleroux. By the time police began pulling apart the stories surrounding him, the years had already done much of the work of hiding the past. Memories had faded, people had moved, relationships had ended, addresses had changed, places that once mattered had become ordinary pieces of the city. But beneath that ordinary surface were 3 women: Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire. 3 women connected to the same man, 3 disappearances separated by years, and 3 stories that, for a long time, appear to belong to completely different chapters of his life. The first chapter began in 1990. Lise Roy was Cleroux's wife. Their relationship existed behind the walls of a home, in the private world where arguments, resentments, and moments of anger can remain invisible to everyone outside. One day, an argument between them escalated. What happened next would eventually become the first known killing connected to Cleroux. But there was something chilling about what came afterward. Lise did not simply disappear. According to the case that would emerge years later, Cleroux took deliberate steps to conceal what he had done. Her remains were separated and buried in different locations, including an area connected to the home where they had lived and another location in Ottawa. Then the years passed. A woman who had once shared a home with him became a name buried beneath the surface of the city. For the people who knew Lise, there was no simple way to understand her absence. A person does not vanish from a life without leaving behind questions. Where did she go? Why did she leave? Why didn't she call? Why didn't anyone see her? Why was there no final conversation, no clear goodbye, no moment that could be pointed to and said, "This was the last time anyone saw her"? Those questions can become unbearable when there is no body, no confession, and no definitive answer. And for years, there was none. The first secret remained buried. Then came 2003. 13 years had passed. Cleroux's life had changed. Lise was gone. But another woman had entered his world. Her name was Jean Rock. She was not merely a passing acquaintance. She was his partner. And then, once again, a woman connected to Cleroux disappeared. Jean Rock vanished in 2003. At first glance, a disappearance can be explained in many ways. Adults leave relationships. Adults move to another city. People begin new lives without telling everyone around them. People stop calling. People make choices that those left behind do not understand. That uncertainty is precisely what makes a disappearance so difficult. The people waiting for answers are forced to live between two possibilities. Maybe the person is alive somewhere. Maybe they simply do not want to be found. Or maybe something much darker happened. Jean's family was left with that uncertainty. And Clairou had an explanation. There were even letters. Letters designed to make it appear that Jean was still alive. Messages that suggested she had left and was continuing her life somewhere else. On the surface, they could have offered reassurance, but a disappearance does not become less disturbing simply because there is a piece of paper saying that everything is fine. Sometimes, the most important question is not what a message says. It is who wanted the message to exist. Years later, that question would become devastating because police would learn that Jean Rock had not simply walked away. Clairou would eventually admit that he had killed her, but that admission was still years away. For the moment, another secret remained hidden. And then came 2010. 20 years had passed since Lise Roy disappeared. 7 years had passed since Jean Rock vanished. And Clairou was still living in Ottawa, still moving through ordinary streets, still surrounded by ordinary people, still carrying a history that almost no one could see. Then there was Paula Leclerc. She was 64 years old. Unlike Lise and Jean, Paula was not Clairou's wife or romantic partner. She was his neighbor. That distinction matters, because the circumstances surrounding Paula's disappearance would eventually expose something that the earlier disappearances had not. A motive that could be seen, a physical location, an apartment, and a man who appeared to want something that belonged to a woman who was suddenly no longer there. Paula Leclerc lived in an apartment that Clairou wanted. The reason, according to the case, was simple and unsettling. He wanted her apartment because of its location and its view. There was nothing mysterious about wanting a better home. People move for better views. They seek larger apartments. They look for quieter neighborhoods. They want more sunlight through the windows. But wanting something is one thing. What someone is willing to do to obtain it is another. Paula disappeared. And then something strange began to happen. Instead of behaving like a neighbor who had lost contact with an older woman, Clairou began behaving as though Paula's absence had created an opportunity. He moved his belongings into her apartment. He attempted to create the appearance that Paula had willingly given it to him. On the surface, he wanted the story to look simple. Paula had made a decision. Paula had chosen to leave. Paula had somehow transferred the apartment to him. Nothing to investigate. Nothing to question. Nothing to fear. But people who knew Paula began to notice that the story did not fit. And among them was her son. He noticed things that did not make sense. The apartment. His mother's disappearance. The circumstances surrounding the supposed transfer. The sudden presence of Clairou inside a space that had belonged to Paula. One detail led to another. Questions became suspicions. Suspicion became a police investigation. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, the past began to move. When investigators looked at Paula's disappearance, they were not simply looking at a missing woman. They were looking at a man whose behavior appeared deeply connected to her absence. The walls around the story began to close in, and as investigators dug deeper, they began asking a question that would transform the case. What else had happened around Camille Clairou? Because Paula was not the first woman connected to him to disappear. There had been another woman, Lise Roy. And before Paula, there had been Jean Rock. The timeline was difficult to ignore. 1990, 1991, 1992. 3 women. 3 different points in time, and one man connecting them. At first, the years between the disappearances could have seemed reassuring. 20 years is a long time. 13 years is a long time. 7 years is a long time. A person could change enormously over those periods. A relationship could end. A life could move in a completely different direction. But investigators were no longer looking at the years separately. They were looking at the pattern. And patterns can change the meaning of individual events. A woman disappears. It could be voluntary. A second woman disappears. It could still be coincidence. A third woman disappears, and the same man is somehow connected to all three. Now coincidence begins to feel different. It begins to feel like a question. And questions, once asked by police, have a way of opening doors that someone has spent years trying to keep closed. The investigation surrounding Paula eventually brought Clairou into custody, and once he was arrested, the story began to unravel. Not all at once. Not like a confession in a movie, where a suspect suddenly sits beneath a bright light and tells investigators everything. The truth came through fragments, names, locations, memories, statements, and eventually admissions. The investigators began looking backward. They revisited the women who had disappeared from Clairou's life. They examined what had been known about Lise. They examined what had been believed about Jean. They searched places that had been ordinary for years. A backyard, a park, wooded areas around Ottawa, places where people had walked without knowing that the ground beneath their feet might contain evidence from a crime committed years earlier. The search for Lisa's remains was especially haunting because of the passage of time. Imagine a backyard 20 years after a disappearance. The grass has grown and died countless times. The seasons have come and gone. Snow has covered the ground. Spring has brought rain. Summer has brought heat. Autumn has buried everything under leaves. People have lived their lives. Children may have grown up. Neighbors may have moved away. And underneath it all, something remained. Eventually, investigators recovered human remains connected to Lise. A mystery that had survived for decades suddenly had physical evidence. The past was no longer only a story told by frightened relatives or an unanswered name on a missing person file. It was there. Real. Irreversible. And then came Jean, the woman whose disappearance had been surrounded by letters suggesting that she had left voluntarily. Those letters now looked very different. What had once appeared to be evidence that Jean was alive could instead be understood as part of an attempt to make people believe exactly that. A false trail, a manufactured explanation, a life that existed on paper, but not in reality. For Jean's family, the revelation would have carried a particular cruelty. A disappearance leaves room for hope. A lie can keep that hope alive for years. And when the lie is finally exposed, the family does not simply lose the person they loved. They lose the years in which they believed she might still be alive. That is one of the darkest dimensions of a long-hidden crime. Time does not always heal the wound. Sometimes time only allows the wrong story to become more deeply rooted. By 2012, the investigation had reached its final chapter in court. On June 26th, Camille Clairou pleaded guilty to all 3 killings. For Paula Leclerc, the charge was first-degree murder. For Lise Roy and Jean Rock, the charges were second-degree murder. There would be no long trial in which a jury spent weeks listening to every detail and deciding whether the evidence was enough. There would be a plea. There would be a sentence. And there would be the unavoidable fact that 3 women had lost their lives. Clairou received a life sentence. He would have to serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. But a sentence cannot reverse time. It cannot return Lise to the life she should have lived. It cannot give Jean's family back the years spent wondering where she had gone. It cannot return Paula to the apartment that had become part of the motive behind her death. And it cannot erase the fact that for years, ordinary life continued around secrets that were anything but ordinary. There is something deeply unsettling about this case because none of the places involved needed to look frightening. There was no isolated mansion surrounded by darkness, no abandoned castle, no distant forest cabin where no one ever went. There were homes, apartments, neighborhoods, parks, backyards, everyday places, places where mail was delivered, where neighbors carried groceries, where people opened curtains in the morning and locked doors at night. That is often where the most disturbing truth of a crime like this lives. The horror is not always somewhere far away. Sometimes it exists in the familiar. It exists behind the door next door. It exists in the person whose name you recognize, but whose history you never bother to ask about. It exists in a story that sounds plausible because everyone wants it to be true. Paula had left. Jean had moved away. Lise was simply gone. For years, these explanations could occupy the empty spaces where the truth should have been. But eventually, those explanations collided with evidence. And when they did, the picture of Camille Cleroux became impossible to look at in the same way. He was no longer simply a man living an ordinary life in Ottawa. He was a man connected to 3 women whose lives had ended violently. A man who, according to the case, had spent years attempting to control not only what happened to his victims, but what other people believed had happened to them. That distinction is important because killing someone ends a life, but constructing a false story afterward can distort the lives of everyone left behind. Families grieve differently when there is no body. They search differently when they believe someone may still be alive. They make decisions differently when they think a loved one simply chose to disappear. And every birthday, every holiday, every unanswered telephone call can become another reminder of a question that has no answer. Until one day, the truth arrives. Not gently, not completely. It arrives piece by piece. A missing woman, a suspicious apartment, a police interview, a name from the past, a location, a search, human remains, a confession. And suddenly, 20 years of silence become one story. But there is still another question. How could it have gone on for so long? How could one disappearance fail to expose the next? How could a second woman vanish from the same man's life without immediately revealing the first? How did Cleroux manage to create explanations that people could accept? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does the pattern tell us about the way he viewed the people around him? Was each killing an isolated act born from a particular conflict? Was there a deeper pattern of control? Did the motives change over time? Or had the same fundamental desire to control people, circumstances, and outcomes been present from the beginning? Those questions would become central to understanding the case, because the story of Camille Cleroux is not only a story about 3 murders, it is a story about disappearance, about manipulation, about the power of an explanation when people desperately want an explanation to be true, and about how long a secret can survive when the person carrying it understands exactly what others need to believe. For 20 years, the city continued to move. Cars passed the streets where these women had lived. People walked through the parks. Neighbors looked out from their windows. The seasons changed. 1990 became 1991, then 2000, then 2003, then 2010, and finally 2012. The dates accumulated quietly, like layers of dust over something buried. But buried does not mean forgotten, and hidden does not mean gone. Eventually, the ground gave up part of the truth. A family refused to accept an explanation that did not make sense. A police investigation connected one disappearance to another, and the man at the center of it all could no longer keep every story separate. The women had been separated by time. The investigation brought them back together. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula Leclerc, 3 lives, 3 different relationships with the same man, 3 disappearances, and 1 secret that had survived for decades, until it didn't. The story begins with a missing woman, but it ends by forcing us to ask something much darker. How many times can a person disappear before someone realizes that the disappearances are connected? And how much time can pass before the silence itself becomes evidence? For Lise, the answer was 20 years. For Jean, 7. For Paula, much less. Because by 2010, something had changed. Someone noticed. Someone questioned the story. Someone looked at what was happening and decided that the explanation did not make sense. And that single decision began to pull apart everything Camille Cleroux had built. The apartment would become a doorway into the past. The past would lead investigators to names. The names would lead them to places. The places would lead them to remains. And the remains would lead to the truth. But before the police could reconstruct what happened, there was another story that needed to be told. The stories of the women themselves. Because in a case like this, the danger is that the killer's name becomes larger than the names of the people he killed. The investigation becomes the story. The suspect becomes the central character. The courtroom becomes the final stage. And the victims become little more than dates attached to a crime. That cannot be allowed to happen here. Before we follow Camille Claireaux into the darkness, we need to step back. We need to meet the women as people, not case numbers. We need to remember that before Lise Roy became a name in a murder investigation, she was someone's wife, someone's family member, someone's familiar voice on the other end of a telephone. Before Jean Rock became a disappearance, she was a woman with relationships, routines, memories, and people who expected her to come home. And before Paula Leclerc became the center of a police investigation, she was a 64-year-old woman living in an apartment that represented her own small piece of the world. The crime took their lives, but it does not get to define the entirety of them. That is where the story must go next, away from the man who eventually stood before a judge, and toward the women whose lives existed long before their names appeared in his story. Because the first question should never be only, what did he do? The first question should be, who were they? And for Lise Roy, that question takes us back to 1990, before anyone knew that a quiet home in Ottawa was about to become the beginning of a secret that would last for 2 decades. Before anyone searched the ground, before detectives began connecting names, before a courtroom would hear the words first-degree murder and second-degree murder, there was simply a woman who was missing. That is how these stories usually begin. Not with a crime scene, not with police tape, not with a confession, with an absence, a chair that stays empty, a telephone that does not ring, a door that never opens, a familiar face that should have appeared somewhere but doesn't. For the people closest to a missing person, the first days can be filled with explanations. Maybe she is staying with someone. Maybe she needed time alone. Maybe she has gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe she will call tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes the next day. The next day becomes another week. And eventually, the questions become heavier than the explanations. That was the kind of uncertainty surrounding Lise Roy. In 1990, there was no way for anyone around her to know that her disappearance would eventually become part of a much larger story. There was no way to look at the calendar and understand that this was the first marker in a timeline that would stretch across decades. 1990. One woman, one relationship, one argument, and then silence. The details of what happened inside that home would remain hidden for years. According to the case, an argument between Lise and Camille Claireaux escalated until Claireaux killed her. Afterward, he did something that would make the crime even more difficult to uncover. He concealed the evidence. He separated Lisa's remains and buried them in different places. One of those locations was connected to the property where the couple had lived. Another was Hetherington Park. Think about what that means in the simplest possible terms. The places where people lived their ordinary lives became places where the past was hidden. A backyard is supposed to be a place for ordinary things. A patch of grass. A fence. A garden. A place where sunlight falls through leaves in the afternoon. A place where someone might stand with a cup of coffee and never imagine what is beneath the soil. A park is supposed to be even more public. Children play there. People walk. Dogs run through the grass. Neighbors pass one another. The world continues. And yet the same ground can hold 2 completely different realities. Above it, life. Below it, evidence. That contrast would become one of the most haunting elements of the investigation. For years, nobody knew. The people walking through Ottawa did not know. The people living near those locations did not know. And the families connected to Lise did not have the certainty they deserved. The absence of a body creates a particular kind of suffering. A death can be devastating, but a disappearance can be cruel in a different way. There is always the possibility, however small, that the person is alive. That possibility can keep hope alive. It can also prevent grief from ever becoming complete. You cannot properly say goodbye to someone when you do not know where they are. You cannot stand beside a grave. You cannot place flowers on the ground. You cannot look at a final resting place and tell yourself that, at least, you know where they are. Instead, there is only the question, where did she go? For Lise, that question would remain unanswered for years. Then came Jean Rock. 13 years is enough time for an entire life to change. A child can become an adult. A marriage can begin and end. A neighborhood can look completely different. A person can move, find new friends, change jobs, create new routines. The world has a way of moving forward, whether we are ready for it or not. By 2003, Lise Roy had been gone for 13 years, and another woman had become part of Claire's life. Jean Rock. Jean was his partner. Then she disappeared. The repetition is difficult to ignore now, but at the time, repetition is not always visible. Each event exists inside its own context. A person disappears. There is a reason offered. There is a story. There are explanations. And unless someone has the full picture, the individual pieces may never appear connected. Claire had an explanation for Jean's disappearance. And then came the letters. Letters that made it appear Jean had left. Letters that could give a worried family a reason to believe that she was somewhere else. That detail would become especially important later, because a written message can carry tremendous psychological weight. We trust words. We trust familiar handwriting. We trust the idea that a person would not write something unless they meant it. A letter can cross hundreds of miles and make someone feel that the person they miss is still within reach. It can turn an empty chair into a temporary absence. It can transform grief into waiting, and waiting can last a very long time. Imagine being a family member who believes someone you love has simply chosen another life. You might be hurt. You might be angry. You might feel abandoned. But somewhere underneath those feelings is hope. The hope that one day the telephone will ring. The hope that a letter will arrive. The hope that the person will walk through the door. And if someone has deliberately created the hope through deception, then the cruelty does not end with the death itself. The deception becomes part of the crime. Years later, after Claire was arrested in connection with Paula LeClaire, he admitted that he had killed Jean. The letters were no longer evidence of a new life. They became evidence of a false one. The woman everyone believed had walked away had never had the chance to walk anywhere. And the people who had waited for her had been waiting for someone who was already gone. Then there was Paula. Her story was different. And in some ways, that difference was precisely what made the case finally crack open. Paula LeClaire was 64. She lived next door to Claire. She had an apartment, and Claire wanted it. Not because of some complicated inheritance dispute, not because of a mysterious business transaction. The apartment itself appealed to him because of its location and its view. It was something he wanted to possess. And according to the case, Paula's disappearance created the opportunity. After she was gone, Claire moved his belongings into her apartment. That action would become one of the details investigators could not ignore, because a missing person leaves behind a space. And the question becomes, who enters that space after they are gone? What happens to their belongings? Who has access? Who benefits? Who suddenly behaves as though they have inherited something they were never supposed to have? Claire attempted to make the situation appear legitimate. He tried to create evidence suggesting Paula had willingly given him the apartment. The story was supposed to be simple, but simple stories can collapse when too many details do not fit. Paula's son noticed. That matters. Because investigations often begin not with a detective standing over a body, but with an ordinary person refusing to accept an explanation. Someone notices that something is wrong. Someone asks a question. Someone makes a phone call. Someone says, "This doesn't make sense." That sentence can be the beginning of everything. In Paula's case, her son's concerns helped bring police into the picture. And once investigators began looking, the apartment stopped being merely an apartment. It became evidence. The belongings inside it became evidence. The story about Paula's supposed decision became evidence. And Claru himself became the focus. The police were no longer simply asking where Paula was. They were asking why a man connected to her disappearance was already acting as though her life had been erased. That was the first crack. And once a crack appears in a carefully constructed story, investigators begin testing it. They ask the same question from different angles. They compare statements. They look at timelines. They speak to neighbors. They examine relationships. They look backward. And looking backward was dangerous for Claru, because there was history there. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire. The names were not random. They belonged to women who had occupied different places in his life. A wife, a partner, a neighbor. Different relationships, different years, different circumstances, but the same man remained at the center. That is when a disappearance stops looking like an isolated event. It becomes a pattern. Patterns are powerful because they change how investigators interpret everything that came before. Imagine looking at a single photograph. You see one face, one expression, one moment. Then someone gives you a second photograph, and a third. Suddenly, details that seemed meaningless begin to matter. A person standing in the background, a location, a repeated behavior, a familiar name. The same thing happens in criminal investigations. The past can change when new information arrives. A missing person who once seemed to have voluntarily left may suddenly look very different when another woman connected to the same man is found dead. A strange letter becomes suspicious. An unexplained absence becomes significant. A story that once seemed plausible becomes difficult to defend. And Clarua's past began to come into focus. The police learned about Lise. They learned about Jean. They began searching for answers that should have been found years earlier. And eventually, the investigation reached the physical places connected to the women. The backyard, the park, the wooded areas, the locations where memory and evidence had been separated by time. There is something almost unbearable about a forensic search in a place that has existed for years without anyone knowing what happened there. Investigators arrive with equipment. They examine the ground. They look for disturbances. They search systematically. Every movement matters. Every patch of soil becomes a question. Every object can potentially tell a story. And when the remains connected to Lise were eventually discovered, the meaning of the past changed forever. She was no longer simply missing. The uncertainty ended, but certainty brought its own kind of pain. The woman who had been missing had not chosen to leave. She had not started another life. She had been killed. And the man who had been closest to her was responsible. For investigators, this was a breakthrough. For a family, it was something more complicated. It was the answer they had needed, and the answer they never wanted. That contradiction lies at the heart of many long-term missing person cases. People want the truth, but sometimes the truth is the thing they are most afraid to find. For Lise, the truth came after years. For Jean, it came through Clarua's own admission. For Paula, it began with the decision of her son to question what he was seeing. 3 paths. 3 women. 1 investigation. And 1 man whose carefully maintained world was beginning to collapse. By the time Claru finally admitted to the killings, the investigators had something far more significant than a suspicion. They had a chronology. They had names. They had physical evidence. They had statements. And they had the accused himself. The story that had once depended on silence could no longer survive. But there was still a disturbing question underneath everything. Why these women? Why at those moments? Why did the violence appear in different forms depending on the relationship? With Lise, the The case centered around an argument inside a marriage. With Jean, there was a disappearance followed by fabricated letters. With Paula, there was an apartment Clairou wanted. The circumstances were different. The outcome was the same. A woman was gone, and Clairou remained. That repetition forces us to look beyond the individual acts and toward the psychology of control, not to excuse it, not to romanticize it, and certainly not to turn a murderer into a character more fascinating than the people he destroyed, but to understand the mechanism. Because control can be quiet. It does not always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like a story repeated until people accept it. Sometimes it looks like a person calmly moving their belongings into a home that belongs to someone else. Sometimes it looks like a letter designed to make a family stop asking questions. And sometimes it looks like nothing at all. That may be the most frightening part. A person does not need to look like a monster to commit monstrous acts. He can stand in a hallway. He can speak to a neighbor. He can answer a question. He can appear ordinary. And ordinary behavior can become a mask. That is why the story of Camille Clairou cannot be understood simply by asking what he did. We have to ask how the people around him interpreted what they saw. Why did the explanations work? Why did the disappearances remain unresolved? Why did the people who love these women have to wait so long? And what finally made the story impossible to maintain? The answer begins with Paula Leclerc. Her apartment became the point where the present collided with the past. Her son saw something that did not fit. Police began asking questions. Those questions opened a door. Behind that door was Jean. Behind Jean was Lise. And behind the names were places. Places that had remained silent for years. The city had changed. The people had changed. But the evidence had been waiting. Waiting beneath soil. Waiting inside memories. Waiting inside old relationships. Waiting in the stories people had been told. And when investigators finally began connecting everything, the timeline became almost impossible to ignore. 1990, 1991, 1992, 20 years between the first known killing and the third. 3 women connected to one man. The first disappearance buried beneath time. The second hidden behind false correspondence. The third exposed because someone questioned the story. That is the sequence that makes this case so disturbing. Not simply that 3 women were killed, but that each disappearance existed long enough to become part of the background. Life continued. People adjusted. Questions remained unanswered. And the man at the center of the story continued living, until Paula's disappearance created a problem he could not completely control. He wanted her apartment, but in trying to take it, he drew attention to himself. The thing he wanted most may have become the thing that exposed him. And that is where the story turns, because the apartment was not merely the place where Paula had lived. It became the doorway through which investigators entered Clairou's past. Once they stepped through that doorway, they found far more than they expected. They found a history. They found a pattern. And eventually, they found the buried remains of a woman whose family had spent years without knowing where she was. But even then, the story was not finished. A murder investigation is not only about discovering what happened, it is about reconstructing what happened. Who was there? What happened first? What happened next? What did the suspect do afterward? What did he say? What did he hide? What did he want people to believe? And what finally forced the truth into the open? Those questions would become the framework for everything that followed. On June 26, 2012, Clairou would stand before the court and plead guilty to 3 murders. But before that day, investigators had to piece together more than 20 years of a man's life. They had to walk backward through time. They had to revisit people who remembered him. They had to revisit women whose names had become associated with uncertainty. And they had to look at places where the ordinary and the terrible had existed side by side without anyone realizing it. The courtroom would eventually provide an ending, but justice could not erase the years before it. It could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not return the years of uncertainty to the families. It could only establish responsibility. And perhaps that is why the beginning of this story matters so much. Because long before the sentence was handed down, there were 3 women living ordinary lives. They had mornings. They had evenings. They had conversations. They had belongings. They had people who knew them. They had plans. And none of them knew how their lives would end. Lise could not have known that an argument inside her home would become the beginning of a 20-year secret. Jean could not have known that the letters supposedly explaining her disappearance would one day be understood as part of a deception. Paula could not have known that the apartment she called home would become the object of a man's desire and, ultimately, the trigger for an investigation that exposed everything. That is the tragedy hidden beneath the timeline. Dates are clean. Human lives are not. 1990 is only 4 digits. 2003 is only 4 digits. 2010 is only 4 digits. But between those numbers were years of life. Years that belong to people. Years that cannot be recovered. And when we tell a true crime story, it is easy to move too quickly. From murder to investigation. From investigation to confession. From confession to sentence. But the victims did not experience their lives as chapters in a case file. They experienced them one day at a time. That is why, before we follow the investigation deeper into the darkness, we have to slow down. We have to step away from the suspect. We have to stop looking at the calendar. And we have to look at the women, not as names in a timeline, not as evidence, not as the people whose deaths eventually led police to a conviction, but as human beings. Lise Roy existed before 1990. Jean Rock existed before 2003. Paula LeClaire existed before 2010. Their stories did not begin with the moment they disappeared. They began long before that. And the next part of the story will begin there. Because when everything else is stripped away, the investigation, the headlines, the courtroom, the sentence, the murderer himself, what remains are 3 lives that mattered. 3 women who should have had more years, more mornings, more ordinary days, more conversations, more memories, and 3 families who deserve the truth much sooner. For years, that truth was hidden. Then one disappearance exposed another. One investigation reopened an old mystery. One name led to another. And beneath the quiet surface of Ottawa, the past began to speak. The first voice belongs to Lise Roy. Before she became the first known victim in this case, she was simply Lise, a woman with a life of her own, a woman whose final chapter was written without her consent, and a woman whose story had been waiting for more than 2 decades to be told. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds a disappearance. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence created when everyone expects a person to return. At first, people leave the light on. They keep the telephone nearby. They check the door whenever they hear footsteps in the hallway. They tell themselves there must be an explanation. Then the days begin to accumulate. The light is turned off. The telephone stops being watched every minute. The footsteps become meaningless. But the question remains, where is she? For the families of Lise Roy, Jean Rock, and Paula LeClaire, that question would take different forms. For Lise, it would survive for years. For Jean, it would be sustained by a carefully constructed illusion. For Paula, it would become the question that finally brought police to the door. 3 women. 3 different circumstances. And yet, when the entire story is viewed from the distance of history, their lives appear connected by a single thread. Camille Claireau. There is something unsettling about that name now. But names do not carry their meaning with them when we first encounter them. A name is just a name. A neighbor is just a neighbor. A husband is just a husband. A partner is just a partner. A man standing in a hallway can look like any other man standing in a hallway. There is no visible warning attached to him. No mark on his forehead. No sign that tells strangers what he has done. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of violent crime. The human mind wants danger to look dangerous. We want the predator to appear different. We want the villain to announce himself, but real life rarely gives us that certainty. Instead, people make judgments based on fragments. A conversation, a reputation, a relationship, a story, a smile, a piece of paper, a person's ability to sound convincing. And sometimes that is enough. For years, Clarua's version of events existed in that space between what people knew and what they could prove. Lee's was gone. Jean was gone. But the world had explanations. The explanations did not necessarily have to be perfect. They only had to be plausible enough. That is an important distinction. A lie does not always have to be brilliant. Sometimes it only needs to fit the expectations of the people hearing it. If someone says a woman left, people may believe it because adults sometimes leave. If someone says she does not want contact, people may believe it because relationships sometimes break down. If a letter arrives suggesting that everything is fine, people may accept it because the alternative is unbearable. Hope can make a weak explanation feel stronger, and grief can make people afraid to challenge it. That is what makes the story of Jean Rock so haunting. Her disappearance was not followed by an obvious crime scene. There was no immediate answer. Instead, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty can be manipulated. The letters became part of that manipulation. They gave shape to a story. Jean had left. Jean was somewhere else. Jean had chosen distance. Jean was alive. Each idea created a different emotional response, but all of them had the same effect. They moved attention away from the possibility that she had been killed. That possibility was difficult to accept, and perhaps that was precisely why the false story could survive. Then there was Paula. Paula's disappearance was different because the person who benefited from it made himself visible. The moment Claru moved his belongings into her apartment, he created a physical connection between her absence and his own behavior. That was dangerous. People can disappear, but objects remain. Apartments remain. Furniture remains. Neighbors remember. Family members remember where things were. They remember how someone lived. They notice when something changes. And they notice when another person begins behaving as though the missing person's life has already been transferred to them. Paula's son noticed. That detail may sound small when written in a case summary. It is not small. It is the kind of detail that can change an entire investigation. Someone notices. Someone refuses to accept the obvious explanation. Someone decides to ask another question. And suddenly, the story begins moving in a direction no one anticipated. Imagine the moment investigators began looking at Paula's disappearance differently. The apartment was no longer simply a place where a woman had lived. It was a potential crime scene. The objects inside were no longer merely possessions. They were potential evidence. The man's behavior was no longer merely strange. It was potentially significant. And the past was no longer safely buried. Once police began examining Clarua's history, they encountered another name, Lise Roy. Then another, Jean Rock. At that point, time itself became evidence. The years between the disappearances could no longer simply be treated as empty space. 1990, 1991, 1992. The numbers sat there in sequence, not proof by themselves, but enough to make investigators ask questions. What happened in 1990? What happened in 2003? What happened in 2010? And why was the same man connected to all three? That is the moment when an investigation can become something much larger. A missing person case becomes a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation becomes a historical reconstruction. And history forces investigators to go places they might otherwise never have gone. Old addresses, old relationships, old memories, old properties, old stories. Some of those stories had probably been told so many times that people no longer remembered where they began. But detectives do not have the luxury of accepting stories simply because they have been repeated. They compare. They test. They challenge. They look for contradictions. They ask what should be there but is missing. They ask what should not be there but suddenly appears. And they look for the physical traces that memory cannot erase. That search eventually led investigators toward the locations associated with Lee's. A property. A backyard. A park. The ground beneath Ottawa. There is something strangely democratic about soil. It does not care who walks above it. It does not care whether someone is rich or poor. It does not care whether the person buried beneath it was remembered every day or forgotten in by almost everyone. It simply holds what is placed inside it. For years, the ground had held the secret. Then investigators came looking. The search for human remains is unlike the search for an ordinary object. There is no emotional distance. Every discovery changes the meaning of the case. A fragment can transform a missing person investigation. A location can transform a suspicion into evidence. A set of remains can give a family something they have been denied for years. But it can also confirm the worst fear they have carried. When remains connected to Lee's were discovered, the question of whether she had voluntarily disappeared was over. The silence had an answer. It was a terrible answer, but it was an answer. And with that answer came another question. Who had done this? The investigation pointed toward the same man, Camille Cleroux, the man who had been connected to Lee's, the man connected to Jean, the man connected to Paula. The three women were no longer separate stories. They were part of one investigation, and that meant the investigators had to reconsider everything they thought they knew. What had happened inside the relationships? What had happened during the arguments? What did Cleroux do after each woman disappeared? What did he tell other people? How did he explain their absence? Where did he go? What did he gain? What did he fear losing? Those questions matter because homicide is not only about the moment of death. It is also about everything that surrounds it. Before. During. After. The preparation. The opportunity. The concealment. The explanation. The attempt to control what other people believe. And in Cleroux's case, the period after the killings became particularly significant. He did not simply disappear himself. He remained. He continued living. He continued existing in the same world as the people who did not know what had happened. That creates a disturbing psychological contrast. The victims are absent. The perpetrator remains present. Families search for answers. The person responsible knows the answer. Families wonder whether their loved one is alive. He knows she is not. Families wait for a telephone call. He knows the telephone will never bring the person back. And if false explanations are added to that imbalance, the suffering becomes even deeper. The person who knows the truth controls the truth, at least for a while. But control has limits. People make mistakes. Stories leave traces. Physical evidence survives. And other human beings remember things. That is what eventually happened. Cleroux could control what he said. He could attempt to shape what others believed. He could create explanations. But he could not completely control the people around him. He could not control Paula's son, noticing that something was wrong. He could not control investigators asking questions. He could not control the passage of time. And he could not control the evidence that remained behind. That is the paradox at the center of the case. The longer a secret survives, the more permanent the world around it becomes. People move, but records remain. Buildings change, but memories remain. Relationships end, but names remain. And the ground remains. 20 years can bury a secret, but 20 years can also create 20 years of evidence. When the investigation finally turned toward Cleroux, those years began working against him. The story that had once existed as separate pieces was being assembled. One piece from 1990, another from 2003, another from 2010, and each piece made the others harder to dismiss. For investigators, this was the beginning of reconstruction. For the families, it was the beginning of an answer. But for the audience telling this story today, there is a danger. We can look at the timeline and assume that the ending was inevitable. It was not. The ending was only possible because someone noticed something, because someone questioned something, because someone refused to let a disappearance remain an unexplained absence. That is why Paula LeClaire's story is so important. Without her disappearance, the earlier cases might have remained buried even longer. Her death became the event that forced the past into the present. The apartment Clairou wanted became the place where his story began to collapse. He had wanted something tangible, a home, a view, a space. But in trying to obtain it, he created the very evidence that exposed him. That irony is difficult to escape. The apartment was supposed to represent possession. Instead, it became the beginning of accountability. And once accountability arrived, there was nowhere left for the earlier stories to hide. Lise could be found. Jean could be named. Paula could be remembered. And Clairou could be charged. The years of uncertainty were finally moving toward a courtroom. But a courtroom can only answer certain questions. Was he responsible? What charges applied? What sentence would follow? The court could establish legal responsibility. It could not reconstruct the mornings that Lise would never see. It could not recreate Jean's future. It could not restore Paula's home to the life she should have continued living. That is why justice and closure are not the same thing. A sentence can punish. A conviction can establish truth. But neither can undo the past. On June 26, 2012, Clairou pleaded guilty to all 3 murders. The legal story moved quickly compared with the 22 years that had preceded it. First-degree murder for Paula LeClaire. Second-degree murder for Lise Roy. Second-degree murder for Jean Rock. Life imprisonment. At least 25 years before eligibility for parole. The numbers are precise. The law requires precision. But human loss is not precise. There is no number that can measure the value of a life. There is no sentence that can calculate the years stolen from a family. There is no legal phrase that can fully describe what it means to spend years wondering where someone you love has gone. And so, even after the conviction, the story did not truly end. Because the family still had to live. The city still had to move forward. The names still had to be remembered. And the women still needed to be seen as more than victims. That is why the next part of the story must slow down. We have spent the opening minutes looking at the darkness. Now we need to look toward the people who existed before that darkness entered their lives. We need to return to the beginning. Not the beginning of the murders. The beginning of the women. Lise Roy was not born a case file. Jean Rock was not born a missing person report. Paula LeClaire was not born a name in a criminal indictment. They lived before they were victims. They had identities that had nothing to do with Camille Clairou. That matters. Because the most powerful thing a true crime story can do is resist the temptation to let the offender become the center of everything. He committed the crimes, but the victims own the lives that came before them. Their lives deserve space. Their humanity deserves attention. And their names deserve to be spoken without being reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. So as we leave the opening of this story, remember the timeline. 1990, Lise Roy disappears. 2003, Jean Rock disappears. 2010, Paula LeClaire disappears. 2012, Camille Clairou admits responsibility for all 3 killings and receives a life sentence. 2021, Clairou dies in prison from what Canadian correctional authorities initially described as natural causes. But none of those dates can tell us what it felt like to be there. They cannot tell us what Lisa's home looked like on an ordinary morning. They cannot tell us what Jean's family thought when she stopped responding. They cannot tell us what Paula's son felt when he realized that something about his mother's disappearance was wrong. For that, we have to leave the timeline. We have to leave the courtroom. We have to leave the killer's confession behind. And we have to return to the beginning. Because the true story does not begin with the man who killed them. It begins with the women who were alive. Before the disappearance. Before the investigation. Before the evidence. Before the courtroom. There was Lise Roy. And somewhere in Ottawa, in 1990, she was living a life that had not yet been reduced to a date. She was a wife. She was a daughter. She was a familiar presence to people who loved her. She was a human being with ordinary expectations about the future. She did not know that an argument would become the final chapter of her life. She did not know that the ground would eventually conceal what happened to her. She did not know that 20 years would pass before investigators would uncover the truth. And she certainly did not know that another woman would one day disappear from the same man's life. Then another. That is what makes the opening of this case so difficult to forget. The pattern only becomes visible after the fact. When you already know the ending, the beginning looks different. A quiet home no longer looks completely quiet. A disappearance no longer looks isolated. A letter no longer looks innocent. An apartment no longer looks like an apartment. Every detail seems to contain a warning. But the people living through those moments did not have the luxury of hindsight. They were inside the story. They could not see the whole picture. Neither could the investigators at first. Neither could the families. Neither could the people living nearby. That is the human weakness that allows some crimes to remain hidden. We experience life one moment at a time. We do not normally connect everything. We do not wake up each morning wondering whether an ordinary conversation will become evidence in a murder investigation 20 years later. We trust the world to remain ordinary. Most of the time it does. But when it doesn't, the ordinary details become the things investigators return to. A door. A letter. An apartment. A backyard. A park. A name. A date. A memory. A missing woman. And eventually, a truth that refuses to stay buried. The story of Camille Claireau is therefore not only about what happened in 3 separate years. It is about what can happen when a secret is allowed to grow. It is about how a lie can become part of someone's reality. It is about how the absence of evidence can be mistaken for evidence of absence. And it is about how one person asking the right question can sometimes reopen an entire past. For years, Lisa's disappearance existed in the dark. Then Jean disappeared. The darkness grew deeper. Then Paula disappeared. And suddenly, someone turned on the light. Not enough to reveal everything. Just enough to see that something was wrong. From there, the investigation became a search. The search became evidence. The evidence became a case. And the case became a confession. But the confession is not where this story should begin. The confession belongs near the end. The beginning belongs to Lise. And to understand what happened to her, we have to understand the world around her before it changed forever. We have to enter Ottawa as it was. We have to understand the neighborhoods, the homes, the relationships, and the quiet routines that form the background of these events. We have to slow down. Because before there was a murderer at the center of the story, there was a city. Before there was a crime scene, there was a home. Before there were police questions, there was an ordinary life. And before there were 3 names on a list of victims, there were 3 women living lives that mattered. The camera now pulls away from the courtroom, away from the confession, away from the cold language of charges and sentences. It moves backward through time, past 2012, past 2010, past 2003, past the discovery, past the investigation, past the questions, until it reaches 1990, a different Ottawa, a different moment, a different life, and somewhere inside that city is Lise Roy, still alive, still part of the world, still unaware that the next chapter of her life has already begun moving toward her. The story starts there, not with a body, not with a police officer, not with a confession, with an ordinary day. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so terrifying. Because the most frightening moment in a true crime story is not always the moment when the crime occurs. Sometimes it is the moment just before, when everything still looks normal, when nobody knows, when the future has not yet revealed itself, when a woman walks through an ordinary room, speaks to someone she knows, closes a door, and believes there will be another morning. For Lise Roy, there would not be. But in 1990, she did not know that, and neither did anyone else. That is where we begin. Ottawa, 1990. Long before the name Camille Claireau would become associated with one of the city's darkest criminal cases, Ottawa was simply a city where people went about their lives. The mornings began quietly. Windows brightened one by one as daylight moved across residential streets. Cars appeared in driveways. Doors opened. People stepped outside carrying briefcases, grocery bags, school books, or nothing more than a cup of coffee in one hand and a set of keys in the other. The city had its own rhythm. It was not the rhythm of a place expecting violence. It was the rhythm of ordinary life. Ottawa sits along the Ottawa River, across from Gatineau, surrounded by the familiar mixture of urban streets, older neighborhoods, wooded spaces, parks, and residential communities that give the city much of its character. Government buildings and busy downtown streets existed alongside quieter neighborhoods where people could live for years without ever knowing more than the names of the families next door. That contrast matters, because the events connected to Camille Claireau did not unfold in some isolated world removed from everyone else. They happened within an ordinary community. People bought groceries. They went to work. They visited relatives. They walked through parks. They returned home in the evening. And behind some of those doors were relationships that outsiders could not fully see. A relationship is always different from the outside. Neighbors see fragments. They might hear voices through a wall. They might notice a couple arguing. They might see one person leaving the house. They might see another person returning, but they rarely know what happens when the door closes. That private space is where much of the early history surrounding Claireau and Lise Roy existed. In 1990, Claireau was not yet a name that carried a warning. He was a man living within the community. He had a home. He had a relationship. He had neighbors. He existed inside the same routines as everyone else. And that is one of the most important things to understand before examining what happened. People who commit terrible crimes do not necessarily live in visibly terrible environments. They can live in ordinary houses. They can have ordinary routines. They can participate in conversations about ordinary things. The human mind often searches for an explanation that matches the horror of the crime. If the crime is extreme, we expect the surroundings to be extreme as well. But the surroundings can be painfully normal. A kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, a hallway, a backyard. Nothing about those places announces what may happen inside them. In a residential neighborhood, privacy is often taken for granted. A closed door is a boundary. People generally respect it. What happens inside belongs to the people who live there. That privacy is essential to normal life, but it can also become a shield. A neighbor may hear an argument and assume it is a private disagreement. A raised voice may be followed by silence. A slammed door may be dismissed as a moment of anger. A person may appear upset one evening and perfectly calm the next morning. Without knowing the full story, outsiders have very little context. This is how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary danger. And the first known killing connected to Claireau began within that ordinary world. Lise Roy was his wife. The details available about her life are limited compared with the details that would later emerge about her death. That imbalance is common in true crime. The record often preserves the crime better than it preserves the person. Police reports document evidence. Court records document charges. Investigators document timelines. But an entire human life rarely fits neatly into those documents. We know a woman existed. We know she had relationships. We know she lived somewhere. We know she was loved. Then suddenly, the record becomes much more detailed about how she disappeared. The person fades. The crime takes over. That is why setting matters. Before Lise became part of an investigation, she existed within a world of ordinary routines. The city around her was changing, as cities always do. Neighborhoods evolved. Buildings were renovated. Families moved. New roads and developments appeared. Old memories became harder to place. The passage of time would eventually become one of the greatest obstacles investigators faced. 20 years is long enough to alter a landscape. A backyard can be transformed. A property can change hands. Trees grow. Fences are replaced. People renovate. Someone who remembers an old house may remember it completely differently from the way investigators eventually encounter it. Time does not simply move forward, it changes the physical world. And that would matter enormously when investigators later searched for evidence connected to Lee's. But in 1990, none of that was visible. There was only the present. And in that present was a relationship between Lee's and Clairou. Relationships are complicated even when nothing criminal is involved. Two people bring different expectations into a shared life. They carry old frustrations. They have arguments about money, family, jealousy, work, personal habits, or things too small to explain to anyone else. Most arguments end. Someone walks away. Someone apologizes. Dinner is made. The television comes on. The lights go out. Morning arrives. The argument becomes yesterday. That is what makes a violent escalation so difficult to anticipate. There is a vast distance between an ordinary argument and homicide. Most people cross neither the distance nor even the first step toward it. But according to the case, an argument between Lee's and Clairou eventually became fatal. The exact emotional landscape inside that home is difficult to reconstruct completely. There are no cameras recording every expression, no transcript capturing every sentence, no outsider standing in the room to preserve the sequence of events. What remains is the evidence that surfaced much later, and that evidence tells us something devastating. The argument did not end with reconciliation. It ended with Lee's dead. Then came the concealment. That part of the story changes the way we look at the setting. A home is supposed to protect the people inside it. But after the killing, the same environment became part of the concealment. The backyard was no longer simply a backyard. It became one of the locations associated with the hidden remains of Lee's. And that transformation is psychologically disturbing. The landscape does not change because we know what happened. The grass still grows. Rain still falls. Leaves still collect. Sunlight still moves across the ground. But our understanding changes. A familiar place becomes haunted by information. This is one of the strange powers of crime. It can permanently change the meaning of ordinary spaces. A street corner becomes the place where someone was last seen. A house becomes the place where someone died. A park becomes the location where evidence was hidden. The physical place remains the same. The human meaning does not. Hetherington Park would eventually become connected to Lisa's story in the same way. To anyone passing through, it could simply be a park, a place to walk, a place to spend time outdoors, a place that belongs to the community. But according to the case, part of Lisa's remains had been concealed there. That information would come much later. At the time, people using the park had no reason to know. They walked over the same ground. They passed beneath the same trees. They went home. The secret remained underground, and the city continued. This is one of the most important ideas in the story of Camille Clairou. The city did not stop because someone had disappeared. There was no dramatic pause in Ottawa's history. The world did not know it was supposed to wait. People still went to work the next morning. Children still went to school. Businesses opened. Traffic moved. Snow came. Snow melted. Summer arrived. The seasons carried everyone forward, except the people who were left behind by Lisa's disappearance. For them, time behaved differently. A missing person creates a strange relationship with the calendar. Every date becomes a reminder. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, family gatherings. A date that once meant celebration can become painful. The longer someone remains missing, the more difficult it can become to know how to grieve. There is no certainty, only absence. An absence can be interpreted in many ways. Maybe she left. Maybe she wanted to start again. Maybe she was angry. Maybe she did not want to be contacted. Maybe she was somewhere else. Maybe she was alive. The possibilities can multiply endlessly. But there is another side to the disappearance. The person who knows the truth does not live inside uncertainty. They know. That imbalance is difficult to comprehend. One side waits. The other side knows there is nothing to wait for. And according to the case, Clairou was the person who knew. He knew what had happened to Lise. He knew where evidence had been concealed. And yet the outside world did not have the same knowledge. That difference would persist for years. Then, 13 years after Lisa's disappearance, another chapter began. By 2003, the world had changed. Technology had changed. Communications had changed. The city had changed. But one thing remained the same. Camille Clairou was still part of the story. This time, the woman was Jean Rock. Jean was his partner. Her relationship with him was different from Lisa's. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance were also different, but the result was tragically familiar. Jean disappeared. And once again, the people around her were left with questions. But this time there was something else. A story designed to explain the disappearance. Letters. Messages that suggested Jean was still alive. A person can be present in someone's life without physically being present. A photograph can make someone feel close. A telephone call can create connection. A letter can do the same. Words written on paper can cross a distance and create the illusion of presence. For Jean's family, those letters could have seemed like proof that she had made a decision to leave. That interpretation would have been painful, but it would have been very different from believing she had been murdered. The human mind often chooses the explanation it can survive. If the alternative is that someone you love has been killed, almost any other possibility can feel easier to accept. Maybe she left. Maybe she needed a new life. Maybe she wanted distance. At least then she was alive. That possibility can become something a family holds on to. And if someone deliberately manufactures it, they are not simply hiding a crime. They are shaping another person's emotional reality. That makes the story of Jean's disappearance particularly disturbing. The deception could continue only as long as the story remained believable. And for years it did. Until Clairou was arrested in connection with Paula Leclerc. Then the past began to surface. Paula's case had one feature that made it especially dangerous for him. A visible benefit. The apartment. Clairou wanted it. And after Paula disappeared, he began using it. This was no longer simply a question of where a missing woman had gone. There was now a question of possession. Why was he moving into her space? Why was he acting as though she had voluntarily surrendered it? Why did the circumstances seem wrong to her son? Why did the story not fit the reality people could see? These questions brought investigators closer. And when investigators looked closer, they found the past. This is how the setting of a crime can become the mechanism of its discovery. The apartment was not isolated. It was surrounded by other people. Neighbors could observe changes. Family could notice belongings. A building has walls, but it also has witnesses. People see who comes and goes. They remember. They may not understand the importance of what they see at the time, but memory can become evidence later. A person might remember seeing someone carrying boxes. Someone else might remember a conversation. Someone might remember that a woman had not been seen for days. Individually, each detail may appear insignificant. Together, they can form a picture. And investigators are trained to assemble pictures from fragments. By 2010, Clairou's world was becoming smaller. The story he had constructed around Paula could not withstand scrutiny. And when police began examining him, they found themselves looking backward. Back to Jean. Back to Lise. Back to years that had seemed disconnected. The setting was no longer just Ottawa in 2010. It was Ottawa across 20 years. That is a very different landscape. Investigators had to navigate not only physical locations, but time itself. What had existed in 1990? Where had Lise lived? Who knew her? What did people remember? What had changed? What remained? The further investigators traveled backward, the harder the reconstruction became. But the past had left traces. The places were still there. Some people still remembered. And most importantly, Claro himself eventually provided information that helped connect the disappearances. The man who had been at the center of all three stories could no longer remain outside the investigation. The setting had changed. The city had changed. But the central figure had remained. And the three women were now connected by a single timeline. Lise, Jean, Paula. The first two disappearances had survived in uncertainty. The third created a visible contradiction, and that contradiction opened the door. The next stage would be to understand the women themselves, because a location can tell us where something happened. A timeline can tell us when. Evidence can tell us what happened, but none of those things can tell us who the victims were. For that, we have to look beyond the crime. We have to step inside their ordinary lives. We have to imagine the people they spoke to, the routines they followed, the relationships they built, the small things that made them recognizable to the people who loved them. Because a victim is not simply the final event in their life. The final event is only the part we know most about. Their lives came first. Lise came first. Jean came first. Paula came first. And before their names became connected to a criminal investigation, they were simply women living in Ottawa. That is the setting in which this tragedy unfolded. A city that looked ordinary. A neighborhood that looked ordinary. A relationship that looked private. An apartment that looked like someone's home. A park that looked like a park. A backyard that looked like a backyard. Nothing announced the horror beneath the surface. Nothing warned the people passing by. And that is perhaps the most unsettling image with which to leave this chapter. A city going about its day. A man carrying his own secrets. A woman living her life without knowing what was coming. And beneath the ordinary landscape, a future crime, waiting to become a mystery. For years, the city would keep moving, but the truth would remain, buried, hidden, waiting, until someone finally began to look. There is another reason the setting matters. It is not only because of where the crimes happened, it is because of how normal those places were. When people hear the words serial killer, the imagination often creates a particular landscape. An isolated house, a dark road, a remote stretch of forest, a place where nobody would hear anything. But Camille Claireau's story does not fit neatly into that picture. The women connected to him lived within an ordinary world. The places around them were not designed for secrecy. They were places where people lived close to one another, yet could remain strangers. That contradiction is one of the defining features of modern cities. You can live beside someone for years and know almost nothing about what happens behind their front door. You can recognize a face without knowing a name. You can know someone's car without knowing where they go. You can hear a voice through a wall without knowing what the conversation is about. And you can see a relationship from the outside without understanding what it feels like from within. That distance between appearance and reality would become important in the story of Lise Roy. She was married to Claireau. A marriage, from the outside, carries an assumption of familiarity. If two people share a home, people naturally imagine that they know one another deeply. They eat together. They sleep under the same roof. They share bills, routines, frustrations, plans. They become part of the same social circle. But intimacy does not guarantee transparency. Sometimes the person closest to you is also the person who knows how to hide things from you. A stranger may be easier to distrust. Someone close to you has already been granted access. That access can take many forms. Access to a home. Access to personal information. Access to routines. Access to trust. Access to the private spaces where other people rarely look. This is one of the reasons domestic violence and domestic homicide can be so difficult to detect before the final act. The relationship itself creates an explanation for behavior that might otherwise seem suspicious. Why is he angry? They are having problems. Why did they argue? Couples argue. Why is she upset? They have been under stress. Why did she leave? Maybe they separated. Every explanation may sound ordinary, and because ordinary explanations are common, they can hide extraordinary situations. The case of Lise Roy began inside that environment. The information available about her personal life is limited. That limitation is important to acknowledge. There are cases in which the public record preserves thousands of details about a victim. Photographs, interviews, friends' memories, letters, employment records, family histories. In other cases, the record becomes painfully thin. The victim's identity is reduced to a few lines: name, age, relationship, date, cause of death. And then the suspect takes over the narrative. That is something a responsible telling of the story has to resist. The lack of surviving public detail about Lise does not mean her life was small. It only means that history did not preserve all of it for us. Somewhere, there were people who knew her differently from the way a court file could describe her. Someone knew her laugh. Someone knew what irritated her. Someone knew the way she spoke when she was tired. Someone knew the things she liked. Someone knew what she was like when she was happy. Those details may never appear in an investigation, but they existed, and they mattered. The same is true of Jean Rock. When Jean became connected to Clairou, she entered a different chapter of his life. By 2003, the world around them was not the same world Lise had known in 1990. 13 years had passed. The technology people used to communicate had changed. The city had evolved. The people around them had grown older. Some had moved. Some relationships had ended. New relationships had formed. The physical environment itself had changed. But one man remained a constant across the timeline. That continuity is what makes the case so disturbing when viewed from a distance. Imagine seeing the 3 years written on a sheet of paper. 1990, 1991, 1992. At first, the dates look disconnected. There is a gap between the first and second. Another gap between the second and third. There is no obvious straight line. But criminal investigations rarely begin with a straight line. They begin with fragments. One fragment might be a missing person report. Another might be a statement from a family member. Another might be an old address. Another might be a suspicious document. Another might be a confession. The investigator's task is to determine whether those fragments belong to the same picture. And with Clairou, they eventually did. But that picture would have been much harder to see without the third disappearance. Paula Leclerc was older than the other women associated with the case. She was 64. She was not his wife. She was not his romantic partner. She was his neighbor. That made the relationship fundamentally different. A neighbor occupies a strange position in our lives. Close enough to observe, far enough to remain separate. You may know when the neighbor receives mail. You may know what their car looks like. You may occasionally speak in the hallway. You may borrow something. You may complain about noise. You may exchange polite greetings. But you usually do not know their deepest personal problems. That limited familiarity can create a sense of safety. A neighbor is familiar. Familiarity can become trust, and trust can become access. According to the case, Clairou wanted Paula's apartment. The reason was connected to the apartment itself, its location, its view. Something about the physical space made it desirable to him. That detail is important because it gives the third case a different shape from the first two. With Lise, the killing emerged from an argument within a marriage. With Jean, the disappearance was followed by an attempt to create the appearance that she had voluntarily left. With Paula, there was something tangible at stake. Property. Space. Possession. A home. And a home is more than four walls. For the person living there, it contains evidence of an entire life. Photographs. Clothing. Furniture. Mail. Personal objects. Things that have no monetary value to anyone else, but are deeply meaningful to the owner. When Paula disappeared, those objects did not disappear with her. They remained. And because they remained, the apartment itself became a silent witness. Clarua's behavior after her disappearance became difficult to separate from what had happened to her. He moved his belongings into the apartment. That act transformed the space. Imagine a room that once belonged entirely to Paula. Her furniture. Her possessions. Her routines. Her sense of privacy. Then imagine another man's belongings appearing inside it. A stranger's things occupying the space of someone who has suddenly vanished. To an outsider, the objects might appear ordinary. A bag. A piece of furniture. Personal belongings. But context changes meaning. A suitcase inside an apartment is normal. A suitcase inside the apartment of a woman who has disappeared is different. A new occupant is normal when a tenant moves out. A new occupant is suspicious when the previous tenant has vanished under unexplained circumstances. That is why Paula's son noticed something was wrong. He knew the space differently. He knew his mother. He knew what belonged to her. And he knew what did not. This is often overlooked when people discuss investigations. Detectives do not always discover the truth because they're standing at the perfect place at the perfect time. Sometimes they discover it because a family member knows the victim well enough to notice an inconsistency. A missing person's life contains thousands of small details. A detective may know the case. A family knows the person. That distinction can be crucial. Paula's son saw a story that did not make sense, and once the story was questioned, the police had reason to look closer. The investigation that followed would eventually reach backward through Clarua's history. That backward movement is where the setting becomes almost like a map. Every place connected to the case carries a different layer of time. Paula's apartment represents 2010. Jean's disappearance takes investigators back to 2003. Lisa's story takes them all the way to 1990. 20 years of history. 20 years of ordinary life, continuing around extraordinary secrets. A map of Ottawa can be read in many ways. Roads, neighborhoods, parks, buildings, distances. But an investigator reads a map differently. A location becomes a question. Why here? Why this property? Why this apartment? Why this park? Why this particular place? And when a person is missing, geography can become a form of evidence. Where was she last seen? Where did she live? Where did the suspect live? What route could someone have taken? What places did they have access to? What locations were familiar? What locations were isolated enough to conceal something? The answers do not automatically solve a crime, but they can narrow the possibilities. And in a case that has remained hidden for years, narrowing possibilities is everything. By the time investigators began examining Clarua's past, the physical landscape had already changed. That created another challenge. The longer a crime remains unsolved, the more the world changes around the evidence. A tree grows. A fence is replaced. A building is renovated. A property changes owners. A road is repaved. A park is maintained. The natural environment does not preserve a crime scene for investigators. It continues. That is why the discovery of Lisa's remains was so significant. The locations connected to her had survived long enough for investigators to search them. Something remained despite the passage of time. The ground had not forgotten, and neither had the investigation, once the right questions were asked. There is a psychological dimension to this, as well. People tend to believe that time makes secrets safer. In some ways, it does. Memories fade. Witnesses move. People die. Documents disappear. Physical environments change, but time can also create contradictions. A story told once may sound convincing. A story repeated years later may contain details that no longer match. People forget what they originally said. They confuse dates. They remember events differently, and investigators can compare those differences. A long-hidden crime, therefore, becomes a strange battle between forgetting and remembering. The offender hopes time will erase. Investigators hope time has preserved enough. The families hope time will eventually bring answers. And the victims cannot speak at all. That final silence makes the physical evidence even more important, because when a victim cannot tell investigators what happened, the scene has to speak for them. The location becomes their witness. The objects become their witness. The people who remember them become their witness. And sometimes, the person responsible becomes the witness against himself. That would eventually happen with Clairou. But before that point, there was still a long road between suspicion and certainty. The police needed to understand the man at the center of the case. They needed to understand his relationships. They needed to understand the circumstances around each woman. And they needed to determine whether the 3 disappearances represented coincidence or something far more deliberate. The answer would become clear, but the path to that answer would force investigators to look at a man who had managed to exist in ordinary society while carrying extraordinary secrets. That is not an easy psychological contradiction to process. We tend to separate people into categories: good people, bad people, safe people, dangerous people. But real human behavior is rarely so visually obvious. A person can be polite in one situation and cruel in another. They can appear calm while concealing something terrible. They can behave normally because normal behavior is part of the disguise. This does not mean everyone around us is secretly dangerous. Quite the opposite. Most people are not. But it does mean that appearances alone cannot explain violent behavior. Clairou's case demonstrates how little the surface of a life can reveal. For years, the outside world saw pieces of a normal existence: relationships, homes, neighbors, daily routines. Nothing about those things automatically signals homicide, and that is precisely why the story remained hidden. The danger was not standing outside the community. It was inside it. Not necessarily in a dramatic way. Not with warning signs that everyone could recognize. It was embedded within relationships and circumstances that appeared ordinary until viewed through the lens of what eventually happened. That lens changes everything. The same apartment looks different once you know why it mattered. The same park looks different once you know what was hidden there. The same backyard looks different once investigators uncover what had been buried. The same letters look different once you know they were part of a deception. The same man looks different once his history is known. This is the strange power of hindsight. It can make the past seem obvious, but it was not obvious to the people living through it. That is an important distinction. We should not judge every person who failed to see the pattern as though they had access to information that only became available years later. They did not have the full picture. They had fragments. The families had fragments. The neighbors had fragments. The police had fragments. Clairou had the whole story. At least he believed he did. He believed that the past could remain divided. Lise in one part of his life, Jean in another, Paula somewhere else. Different years, different explanations, different circumstances. But investigations have a way of collapsing those divisions. Once the names were placed together, the timeline became visible. Once the locations were compared, the geography became meaningful. Once the statements were examined, the stories began to overlap. And once the physical evidence was found, the past could no longer be dismissed as speculation. The city itself had become part of the evidence. Ottawa had not known what it was carrying, but the city had carried the story all along, under its streets, inside its buildings, among its neighborhoods, in the memories of its residents, and within the history of one man. That is where the setting of this case becomes more than background. It becomes a character, a silent character. It does not speak. It does not remember in the human sense, but it preserves. It preserves locations. It preserves distances. It preserves buildings. It preserves the shape of places where people once lived. And when investigators return years later, those places can help reconstruct what happened. The city does not explain the crime, but it can show investigators where to look. And sometimes that is enough. By 2010, the setting had changed dramatically from the world of 1990. But one thing remained constant. Clairou was still moving through it. The same basic human world surrounded him. People trusted. People assumed. People looked forward. People went home. People believed that the missing person might still be somewhere. That belief could last only until the evidence became impossible to ignore. When Paula's disappearance forced that moment, the old world began to collapse. The apartment was no longer simply a desirable space. It was part of a homicide investigation. The missing woman was no longer simply absent. She was a victim. And the man who had tried to make her disappearance look voluntary was now being examined through a completely different lens. Then the investigators began asking about the women who had come before. That question is where the setting finally gives way to the people. Because the streets and buildings can tell us where the story happened. The dates can tell us when, but the women can tell us why the story matters. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire. Their lives existed separately before the investigation connected them. They did not know they would become part of the same case. They could not have known that their names would one day appear together. And they certainly could not have known that the disappearance of one woman would eventually help explain the disappearance of another. That is the cruel architecture of this case. The women were separated by time. The investigation brought them together. The city connected the locations, and the truth connected the lives. Before we move deeper into what happened, there is one final image worth holding on to. Picture Ottawa at night. Windows glowing across apartment buildings. A few cars moving along the streets. A pedestrian walking home. A light switching off in one room. Another turning on somewhere else. Behind each window, a private life. Arguments. Laughter. Television. Dinner. Telephone calls. Plans for tomorrow. The city looks peaceful from a distance. It always does. But peace on the outside tells us very little about what happens behind closed doors. Somewhere in that ordinary city, a woman was living the final period of her life without knowing it. Somewhere else, another woman would eventually disappear. Years later, another would vanish. And for a long time, nobody would understand that these events belonged to the same story. The city would continue sleeping. Morning would come. People would go to work. The seasons would change. And beneath all of it, the truth would wait. Not because the truth had disappeared, because no one had yet learned where to look. Then someone did. And once they did, everything changed. The setting was no longer just Ottawa. It was a map of unanswered questions. A home. An apartment. A park. A backyard. 3 women. 1 man. 20 years. And beneath the ordinary surface of all of it, a story that had been waiting for someone to put the pieces together. Now, for the first time, we step away from the streets and the buildings. We step away from the suspect. We step away from the timeline. And we turn toward the people whose lives gave this story its meaning. Because before Lise Roy was missing, she was alive. Before Jean Rock was a name in an investigation, she was living her own life. Before Paula LeClaire's apartment became evidence, it was simply her home. The next chapter begins with those lives. And that is where the real story should begin. There is a moment in every investigation when a place stops being merely a place. A house becomes an address in a case file. An apartment becomes a crime scene. A park becomes a search location. A backyard becomes a piece of evidence. The transformation does not happen because the buildings change. It happens because knowledge changes. Before the investigation, a person sees a backyard and thinks about grass, fences, weather, maintenance, perhaps a garden. After the investigation, that same person may look at the ground and wonder what happened there. Before the investigation, an apartment is simply someone's home. Afterward, every object inside it can carry a question. Who placed it there? When was it moved? Why was it moved? Who benefited from the change? The physical world remains almost exactly where it was, but the meaning of that world has been permanently altered. This is one of the reasons the Camille Claire case is so unsettling. The places associated with the women were not distant from ordinary life. They were part of it. The crime did not happen in a world separated from society. It happened within society. And for years, the people around those places continued living without knowing what had occurred. That is difficult to imagine. A neighbor can walk past a house every morning without knowing that something terrible happened there. A person can spend an afternoon in a park without knowing that investigators will one day search that same ground. Someone can enter an apartment and see nothing unusual, because the most important fact about that apartment is invisible. The absence of knowledge creates its own kind of normality, and normality can be remarkably convincing. That is what allowed the years to pass. 1990 became 1991, then 1992, then the middle of the decade, then 2000. The calendar kept moving. For the outside world, the disappearance of Lise Roy became part of the past. But the past is not always finished simply because people stop talking about it. Sometimes it remains active beneath the surface. A family remembers. A name remains in old records. A person continues carrying knowledge that no one else has. A location continues holding physical evidence. And a secret can remain alive for as long as the person protecting it remains silent. That is what makes a long unsolved case different from a crime that is solved quickly. When police arrive within hours or days, the world is still close to the moment of violence. Fresh memories, fresh evidence, fresh emotions, fresh traces. But when 20 years pass, the investigation becomes an excavation of time. The investigators are no longer looking only for what happened. They are looking for what survived. What survived the weather? What survived renovations? What survived changes in relationships? What survived the fading of memory? What survived the death or disappearance of witnesses? And what survived inside the mind of the person who knew the truth? For Lise Roy, the answer was hidden in several places. Her remains had been concealed in different locations. One was associated with the old property. Another was Hetherington Park. The significance of those places would not be understood immediately. At first, they were simply part of the landscape. The park remained a park. The property remained a property. People had no reason to imagine that the ground beneath them contained evidence of a crime. That is one of the most disturbing things about buried evidence. It does not announce itself. There is no visible boundary around it. No sign. No warning. The surface can look completely undisturbed. A person can stand a few feet away and never know. That silence can last for years, sometimes decades. And then investigators arrive. They change the atmosphere immediately. The ordinary relationship people have with a place disappears. The location is measured, examined, searched. Every detail becomes potentially meaningful. The people conducting the search are no longer looking at the landscape as residents would. They're looking at it as investigators. A patch of ground is no longer just a patch of ground.